So Dr. Kenneth Vaden is an assistant professor of otolaryngology at the Medical University of South Carolina, where he uses brain imaging and biostatistics methods to study age-related hearing loss and listening difficulties. Alongside his academic work, he creates generative art using custom-written code in the R programming language. His algorithmic artworks use geometry and simple rules to generate complex visual systems, blending scientific thinking with an emergent creative practice. All right, Dr. Vaden, we'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Christy, and thanks, Alexander, for a really excellent introduction about humanistic STEM. I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint here. Here we go. And just confirming really quick, that's the PowerPoint, not the presenter view. Okay. Thank you very much for a great introduction. This is a talk that I'm really excited to give, and I really appreciate being invited to present today. The title of my talk is Creative Emergence, STEM, Curiosity, and Algorithmic Art. And I'm Kenny Vaden, an assistant professor, a research faculty at Medical University of South Carolina. There we go. So for the overview, I'll be discussing foundations in science, kind of a little bit of background about myself and my interests and how that led me into generative art and algorithm-based art. I'll be discussing kind of a conceptual framework about curiosity, systems thinking, and emergence, and how those play a role in science and how that, again, bridges into art. Throughout the talk and towards the end, I'll be highlighting algorithmic art by artists whose work I love. And of course, there's not enough time to talk about everyone, but I wanted to highlight some of my favorites. And then I'll discuss some shared creative processes between art and science, and then discuss implications for STEM. And then I don't know, I'm not sure if we're going to be asking questions throughout the talk, but if we're asking questions, I'm happy to answer them as I go or after the talk. So we'll start with this this plot. So this was something where I was a figure a long time ago that I was working on, where I was mapping significant age-related effects on a white matter tract that we had mapped with diffusion tensor imaging from the brain. And this is the inferior frontal occipital fasciculus. So it's also called the IFOF. And I was inspired by some really amazing MATLAB plots that some of our collaborators on the West Coast had developed. And I wanted to see what I could do in the R statistics language. And this was kind of a foundational plot because I had to figure out how to plot the little segments of each tract in the correct order. I started playing around with shading and light, and eventually added the actual significant effects that I was trying to see on the structure. So this is the inferior frontal occipital fasciculus here. And we can see sort of I guess my mouse isn't going to work, but on the left side, you can see the anterior end, and on the right side, you can see the posterior end. And so this is what I normally kind of give my talks on, this thing that I have my PhD in. But making this plot inspired me, and it really made me wonder if I could use the same scientific tools that I use for science to make art. And so to give you a little bit more about my research background, some of the best advice I ever got was be able to program your lunchbox. It basically means that you have to be able to program a lot when you're working on your postgraduate work, and that proved to be true. My postdoctoral work and research since has really been focused on age-related hearing difficulties, listening difficulties, and hearing loss, and trying to kind of break down the different types of hearing loss that older adults commonly experience. I also studied the brain systems that support task engagement and challenging listening conditions, and so that IFOF is part of a larger set of systems that seem to be affected by age. So there was lots of coding, lots of statistics, and many, many plots. And to the left, you can see this was kind of my first attempt to take some of the lessons that I had learned from plotting those white matter tracts and using it to make art. And what I was doing was a random walk in 3 dimensions. and then plotting all of the segments from the farthest away to the closest. And this was just kind of an interesting bridge for me because it was purely creative. It didn't have any real data in it, but it was using a lot of the conceptual tools that I had, developed in pursuit of a beautiful plot for publication. Between science and art, there's a lot of cross-talk between the approaches. We go through a process of exploration and iteration in science, and this is especially true with art. There's discoveries along the way, replication in new data sets or in new forms, and documentation. And I think, especially as an algorithmic artist, it's really important to come up with ways to explain to a lay audience what you're doing. Like, how does this algorithm work, and what are what your goals were when you were trying to code something. And so a lot of this came out of a sort of pandemic art practice. And so this plot was kind of a seed that grew into a body of artwork as I worked on daily artworks from the confinement of my house. So there's some big conceptual ideas outside of things like keeping a lab notebook or maintaining old code. There are, I think, bigger conceptual parallels between scientific and artistic creative pursuits. And so the big ideas for the talk today are curiosity, systems thinking, and emergence. And in curiosity, like, obviously we're exploring unknown possibilities. So as I was working on generative art, the process involves editing your code, viewing the results, editing your code some more, viewing the results again. And the video to the left is showing that process. So it's a couple minutes long, and it's showing hundreds of frames where I was going through and, well, what if I changed this, or what if I tweaked that? You don't get that with biostatistics or with data analyses where you're cleaning up the data and you're figuring out what's broken in your code. But I think that this kind of reflects that type of iterative process where you explore and you learn things about the data and learn things about the code. And so in art, I asked myself a lot, how could I make that? How could I do this? And in science, you also ask that question quite a lot. And it involves a process of experimentation and problem solving and iteration, just looking at failures and trying to improve the results over and over. To the left, this was an attempt to do code in 5 minutes, and it ended up being hours of time, and I never really liked the final result with that one. But it just kind of highlights the process that we go through as artists. So anyway, innovation comes from bringing outside ideas to old problems, and I think this kind of coding that I've done for many, many years and learning to control the plot area and dots per inch and the size of the font and everything for publications led me to have pretty exquisite control over the plot region. And so I was able to bring a lot of the tools I had developed and the skills and techniques from science into art. Likewise, I feel like at this point, whenever I make a new plot in science, a lot of what I've learned from art informs that. And so I think that creative process can kind of feed sort of two interests and help you learn things in each domain. It's very important that your approach shapes the solutions that you may consider to a problem. And so, again, like, because I used art statistics language, that shaped the types of artwork and the types of plots and even the types of prints that I would eventually make. And likewise, people who brought a different background, whether it's Python or P5JS, or an engineering background versus a biostatistics background, that all of these different approaches sort of shape the art that you see. And so that is something that we'll see a little bit with the different generative artists that I highlight today. But it basically creates we basically are in the process of like creating a framework for structured exploration. So you take the tools that are familiar to you that you've kind of mastered, and then you start applying them to something totally different. So to the left is another example of curiosity driving experimentation, although I don't go through the entire process there. But my question here was, how could I use a random number matrix to control isometric columns? And so I like squares. and I like waves, and so I wanted to figure out a nice way to basically control the layout here and make isometric columns that created kind of an undulating surface. And you know, the long and short of it is I figured out a Gaussian smoothed random number matrix would do the trick. But this is a really specific instance of taking tools that I'd regularly used in science, where we want to maybe smooth high frequency noise out of the data, so we can focus on larger trends, and that could carry over to art. So a lot of times we see in science and art that you begin with curiosity and exploration. Now, this is work by another artist who goes by Finger Code. It's Junior Ngoma. He's from Cameroon and lives in London. And this was his description. This is a color and motion experiment exploring how movement and colors affect moods. And he titled it Rorschach. And so, you know, he uses a different tool set than me. He's using software called Touch Designer, but he definitely has a lot of code art in his toolkit. And this was, like I said, another really cool experiment, and it was an artistic experiment. Another really big experimenter in the artistic domain is Neil Shivdasani. He's from Atlanta, Georgia, and does these just fabulous works. And on the left, you can kind of see the progression of his work over the years. And on the right was kind of a really cool experimental piece. I don't have a video of this, but he has a grate that you view the artwork through, that sort of dark square. And as you drag the grating along, it animates the artwork, even though the artwork is stationary. And so I think you know, he's using some really cool visual effects there. But yeah, he's really a well-known experimentalist, and he does artwork with concrete and all kinds of cool materials. So I wanted to highlight his work. This is the part of the talk where everybody can kind of cross their eyes a little bit if you want. This is a stereogram generative art that I made. So when you kind of cross your eyes slightly, you can cause these two images to fuse binocularly. And this is where I kind of wish I could see everyone's faces to see if anyone is doing this. But at any rate, this is a fun experiment that I did, and I was curious whether I could get the visual separation of the two structures just right to recreate depth, and I was able to do it. So again, this is just an example of curiosity is the engine of discovery. Jens Klarholm is another artist who he has a background in engineering, and it shows in his work. He does these really amazing homemade robots that he uses for creating these beautiful plots, like the one that's shown in this video. You know, I will say, like, as a disclaimer or spoiler alert, that this video does not show robotic paper destruction. A lot of his videos do. He traumatizes the paper sometimes. But through a prolonged process of trial and error and persistence, he produces these beautiful results with his artwork. He's based out of Sweden. And yeah, engineering code artist. And again, like he spends time not just designing the systems, but 3D components to hold the pens, exhaustively experiments with ink sets and paper, and has done work with various media, including just purely digital artwork, and also different sunlight exposure techniques to the art. So again, Jens and I have gone back many years online, and yeah, he's a really cool tinkerer, I would say. I've done a little bit of work myself with robotic pen plotter that I did not build, but you know, basically this is a nice way to kind of see how, again, you can experiment in physical media, not just digital. And so I'm sure there's some people in the audience who are working with robotics, and this is something you can consider, is making a complete mess and saturating your paper with paint and exploring that process. And in the end, through like a lot of trial and error, like, you know, you can slowly discover techniques that will work. So we can see here, that the code that I wrote basically created a series of parallel tracks. And then I even set up points based on measuring how far the wet paint would drag to sort of dot the paper, and then the pen would get dragged through these parallel paths and create these really beautiful lines. And so moving on from curiosity to systems thinking, systems thinking is really thinking like a type of framework where you think about components, processes, relationships, and rules. And so we're kind of moving beyond experimentation and thinking about systems. And part of the reason that I used this artwork to highlight systems is that this artwork was using a series of circles that were descending from the top of the screen, and they weren't allowed to overlap with each other much. And then the lines are sort of settling on top of them like sedimentation processes in geology. And so, systems thinking involves understanding how relationships between components produce behavior. On the left, you can see that these circles are basically undulating with like a nice periodicity to them, where they kind of expand and shrink over time using a sinusoidal function, which is like a really nice way to create kind of a looping, an infinitely looping artwork if you're doing animated artwork. In science, like we think of systems as cells, tissues, systems, organisms. Another example is like in terms of an hierarchy, or neurons, layers, circuits, and ultimately behaviors from organisms. So these are, we can apply the same sort of thinking in art with shapes, rules, randomness, as well as iterations and transformations on the visual elements in the piece. So this is by Amy Goodchild, a London-based artist, and you can see here that she's using a flow field to basically control the pathways of these lit up paths, and they're just really beautiful. Another I thought example of artwork that kind of falls into systems thinking was Matter Waves by Amy Goodchild. And you can see like she's exploring the idea here of light as particles and waves. And so you can see this kind of really nice flow between the two states of particles and fields, and just wonderful color choices. This is another artwork in that series that she did, Matter Waves. And then finally, this is kind of this is an animation that I did involving a lot of individual little pieces that operate within a system, and it works by, I'll rotate it. I'll get it rotating again. You can see that each of these little elements are moving around, and then it's a little less obvious that they start over at the bottom again when the wave moves from the back of the screen to the front of the screen. It's the same elements, so it looks kind of like you're moving through a tunnel. And then the colors are basically gradually shifting and determined by the location within the wave. And so there's kind of a lot of things going on in this piece. And then on top of it, I was using music to determine the undulation of the base of the wave. And this was kind of a nice example. It would have been a nice example of kind of exploration and experimentation, but it was a little too photosensitive in terms of the flashing lights when I was working on this in the early days of this animation. But yeah, so this uses a lot of systems to kind of organize all of the little pieces so that they all work together. And then sort of the final big concept that I wanted to discuss today is emergence. And emergence is a key concept in generative art where complexities arise from simple rules for interactions. Emergence describes how unpredictable and complex outcomes arise from simple rules. So again, this is kind of, building onto the preceding concept of systems-based thinking. And there are examples in science of ant colonies where the individual behavior of ants makes the collective behavior of the anthill a little less predictable, in the sense that the ants collectively are accomplishing what we might think of as almost like a single organism's tasks, right? So instead of dividing all of the functions of cells and tissues and systems into, one organism, the colony of ants kind of operates as a single whole. The same can be true for birds flocking and murmuration, where birds form these complex patterns by just trying not to crash into one another and having a few simple rules about which way they're going to go. And they can create these just hypnotic waves of movement that confuse predators or maybe even scare predators away. And finally, like brain systems, we can think about the complexities of human thought arising from neurons and neural circuits. They're fairly simple units, and yet they're accomplishing so much. And so, they're and I guess like the last thing that I was thinking about outside of collective behavior, is that the scientific process itself generates unanticipated discoveries. A lot of times we have a goal in mind, we're executing on that particular goal, and we're interested in this particular question, and we see something curious, or we do something a little funky with our analysis and then see something we didn't expect, and then we go back and it's real. And so I do think like you read about these types of things all the time in terms of the scientific process, and there are a lot of surprises and pleasant surprises, I think, sometimes in science, and just as a result of kind of being persistent and working at it. In artwork, we see examples of complex outcomes in the sense of flow fields or rules. Here I have stacking dishes, these little circles that are getting, undulating in size and shifting randomly across space, but they form these kind of neat little columns with just a couple of simple rules. And the effect of the whole piece is much bigger than, one or two little circles moving around randomly. And so I think like, in art, we see these common fates and collective behavior and Gestalt principles that kind of organize visual perception in a way that the effect of a artwork can be a lot bigger than what you expected when you were working on it in the first place, but also what you would anticipate based on the elements and the rules that you have. This is an example of emergence that is from Eric Calderon. He did an artwork called Chromie Squiggle. And this is an example of a single chromie squiggle in the sort of upper left. And the reason that I chose this as an example of emergence is that it shows the algorithm. Like this artwork, when you see all of the artwork together, you can see all of the possible variations that this algorithm could produce. This really simple algorithm where you're shifting across a set of sort of neon colors, and you have a wave that kind of randomly is perturbed, but it's smooth. And, in some cases there are outlines, in other cases there are empty circles or blurry circles, small or big circles, but there's not, on the basis of just a few different properties, he was able to generate about 10,000 of these. And you can view all of them on a single web page, which is pretty amazing. And this is artwork by Itzel Yards, or IX Shells. She created this artwork called Interlinked, and this was an homage to women in art. And I did not include the music, which was like really beautiful music as well, but it's just a little loud, or I was worried about the volume. But you can see here, she's using flow fields to basically control the drift of little visual elements that are all linked together. And it just, to me, like this really captures well the idea of emergence, because individually, all of these elements have very simple behavior, and they themselves are very simple. They're squares, they're little lines, there's, some shading involved. But all together, the effect of the artwork is that it comes to life. It looks like it's alive and moving, and so it has kind of an intuitive or an instinctive element that she's managed to really bring out with her artwork in beautiful ways. This is artwork by A. Mashiro from Tokyo. And was able to get a quote from him regarding art and science. And so what he said was, what I find fascinating is the unexpected output, the uncontrolled parts. In science, it leads to new discoveries. In code art, it becomes beauty and individuality. And Amashiro uses balance and color in his artwork to try to these simple visual elements to try to create kind of balanced works. And so in this collaboration with Yuan Lin, they created this really beautifully balanced outputs. And I should note, each one of these rectangles is a single output from the algorithm. And so again, you can kind of see how the sum is greater than the whole of its parts in kind of a gestalt sense. This is artwork entitled Jazz by an artist who goes by Fingacode, Junior Ngoma. He's a London-based artist, and he gave me a quote about science and art. And he says, "My process begins with code as a sketchbook, where I explore simple rules and let repetition, randomness, and constraint shape the outcome. I'm interested in the space between control and emergence, building systems that feel alive, where the final form is discovered rather than fully predetermined. Each piece becomes a record of that dialogue between intention and autonomy." And I do think, like, generative art and algorithm-based art, prior to AI, really emphasized autonomy, like the idea that you're building a machine that will create art independently of you. And so I think he's of that kind of classical tradition here. Here's some artwork by Mood Soup. These are different iterations, I think, as he was working on concepts for his art, shown on the right. And I have a quote from him as well. "Which laws or conventions or deviations shape our world? How does complexity emerge from a basic set of rules? And how can these laws, whether hidden or apparent, be represented visually? Through generative art, these inquiries take shape as innovative concepts, ideas, shapes, colors, and patterns in a new aesthetic. The creation of generative art is always the result of a process of exploration, refinement, filtering, and optimization. Sometimes serendipity takes over in the course of the process. That's where magical moments, unexpected discoveries, and happy accidents arrive." So that's Mood Soup, and he's a Belgian artist. So, happy accidents as an idea that he brings up really briefly in his quote. And, this is a parallel, I think, in art and science, that happy accidents are more common and or often occur in coding. And they, a lot of times if you have an accident in science, it's an oops, and an experiment is wasted, or, data or not showing what you were hoping. But sometimes we have these happy accidents, and the artwork that I'm showing above here is where I had a oops with my code, where I was trying to play around with circles, and they started to form these really interesting patterns that reminded me of the screens that you see on television from the 50s when programs were pulled. So both art and science sometimes involve an element of luck and outcomes that exceed expectations. And then this is the random number generator in the slide about random number generation. We use the random number generator to both generate randomness, but also to control the state of randomness in both art and science. I mean, for science, and I'm sure this is the case with engineering, if you introduce stochastic elements, in particular statistic tests, we want to make sure that the results are perfectly replicable. And so you seed the random number generator. And so when we do these long form artworks, similarly, we use a random number generator to produce unexpected and random looking outputs, but we also want to make sure that we can freeze the artwork in a particular state. So that's kind of a nice parallel between those. Finally, I wanted to kind of highlight the importance of roles and community in both art and science, mentors and community. On the left, I see Forrest Young. He taught me stats and programming, and emphasized visualization, which I think is really important. And then, there's a crew of stained glass artists that I worked with in the summer. I'm the guy in the back with long hair. On the right, we've got some people discussing artwork at art blocks. But you can basically, and a gallery with my art in it, which was fun, and meeting other artists. And so I do think like that community in science and art both really help you learn about, how to be a better artist or how to be a better scientist and what's interesting right now to people and what do people think. And so I think like it's really those relationships kind of shape your work as well. Okay, so in terms of implications for science and art, algorithmic art has technological roots that reach to the start of modern computing machines, and as a result, like this art type of art shares important features with science, probably more so than other types of art. Um, but it includes creativity, systems-based thinking, and emergence, which are sort of big concepts I think here in common to both. I think scientists and engineers can benefit from engaging with artistic processes because creativity drives innovation and discovery. And finally, I wanted to thank Christy Reynolds and the HSTEM organizers for the kind invitation to speak today. I wanted to thank the artists who gave me quotes and permission to include their art, including Jens, Clara Holm, Amy Goodchild, IX Shells, Finger Code, Neil Shivdasani, Amashiro, Mood Soup, and Snowfro. And I'd like to thank everyone for their attention.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Do we have any questions from the audience? We do have a microphone if anybody would like to ask any questions. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dr. Vaden. Are you able to hear me?
Yep.
Awesome, thanks. That was a great presentation. Really appreciate it. Algorithmic art is a very hot topic right now. And while watching your presentation, I was really struck by the difference between you do, which is like using algorithms to make visualizations of like data based on things in the world, right? Versus, the kind of generative AI art, which is more like meta artistic in the sense that it's like, here's an algorithm that has analyzed art to try to make art, rather than an algorithm based on data, right, from something in the world, like a brain, something in the brain or something in the cosmos to create art. So I guess I was curious what your thoughts are about the difference between these types of algorithmic art, right? Like, I don't want to ask like the question is like, is Gen AI art really art? But it seems like there's a really qualitative difference between these two kinds of processes. So I guess I just wanted to ask your thoughts about that.
Yeah. I think in the generative art, traditional generative art community, there was a lot of excitement and interest in AI art at first, and I think it kind of, I wouldn't say that it's peaked. Like I think that there are people who figured out clever ways to incorporate AI into their artwork, and I anticipate that future generations may not have to master code through 15 years of research experience in the way that I did. They may be able to ask AI, like, how do I, make a circle, and not have to really like hammer it out that way. So I do think that AI will play a role. I think that to some degree, it's kind of up to an artist to decide like what tools to use. And how to use them. I think in my practice, like I find traditionally hammering it out relaxing. That's what I like to do at the end of the day. I don't really want to ask AI how to do things. But occasionally, like I'm scratching my head, can't remember a function name or a package name, and I'll ask. I'll just, what is the name of the function that contains the Gaussian smoothing function that I'm trying to use? Okay, cool. It's fat stats. So I do think like there is a role for AI. I will say like the artwork that I do generally does not use data in it. Like I really like to use a random number generator to really like drive the variation. But occasionally, like there is art that I've done that like used my own brain image, for example. But I'm trying to think, does that answer your question? I feel like there was something else about AI in there, but.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Any other questions from the audience? I had one question. Do you ever find that the coding you do for your artwork then feeds into your scientific research coding? Have you mastered any techniques that then you're like, oh yeah, I could totally apply this to the research project I'm working on?
Absolutely. Yeah, there are definitely instances like learning how to blend colors, like with I'm trying to remember if this was a hand. I think I hammered out a function to blend colors at one point, although I think there are some that exist in the world. Other things that would include like figuring out how to orient shapes. So flow fields are I mentioned them kind of obliquely and didn't really get into how they work. But a lot of times what we're doing is using some sort of information to determine the angle of different visual elements. And so in my own work, like a really clean example that comes to mind is a plot where I was showing the trajectory of hearing loss along a couple of different axes and rotating these little triangles or pointers to show like how people's hearing loss would change. If they were here with their hearing loss, where would they be in 10 years or 20 years? And so being able to show kind of the full field of measurements and where everyone went at once was like I felt like that was a artistic / scientific achievement for me.
That's great. Hey,
Yeah.
if there are no other questions, I think we can let you go. Thank you so much for your time. That was fascinating. That was a wonderful way to start off our morning.
Happy to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I hope it inspires some people to try their hands with creative pursuits. I mean, it doesn't have to be code art, but it's really fun to kind of exercise those parts of your brain. And code art is just one way to do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.